My name is Ashleigh Buckett, and I'm a Principal Solicitor here at the National Justice Project. Thank you so much for joining us today to discuss what Australian lawyers and advocates can learn from the state of justice in the USA. We are actually going to begin with a poll today. It's anonymous, and we encourage you to vote. Our first poll question is, how concerned are you about the state of justice in the United States? Very concerned, a bit nervous. It's not happening here, so I'm not too worried, or not at all. The question and answer feature is also open, and questions can be added in at any time. You can also upvote questions from others if you would like to hear them asked. So let's turn to our panelists for today. Dan Mori is a co-founder and board director of the National Justice Project. He's an American lawyer who attained the rank of Lieutenant Colonel in the United States Marine Corps and was the military lawyer for Australian Guantanamo Bay detainee David Hicks. Dan currently works for Shine Lawyers and is also a lecturer at Monash University in International Humanitarian Law and Terrorism. Dan has worked as a police officer in Maine during the 1980s and in New Hampshire from 2018 to 2021. We are also joined by my brilliant colleague, Chloe Fragos. Chloe is a qualified lawyer who previously worked for the Women's Legal Service of South Australia, the Central Australian Women's Legal Service, and NPY Women's Council. Chloe is the campaign lead of the National Justice Project's Alternative First Responders Project, which advocates for a shift away from police first responses by building support for investment in alternative first responder models that deliver safer and more effective outcomes for our communities. Chloe will be joining us again a bit later to talk about alternative first responders, but for now, let's take a look at the poll results and then chat with Dan about the rule of law. We are just wrapping up the poll results at the moment. Here they are. Okay, so overwhelmingly, people are very concerned. 76% of people very concerned, 20% a bit nervous, 2% it's not happening here, so I'm not too worried, and 2% not at all worried. So really interesting feedback to give some context to the discussion that we'll be having today. So Dan, I've got some questions for you. The first one is in relation to rule of law. Of course, the idea that no one is above the law and that the law is applied equally and fairly. It's under threat around the world, including in the USA. What do you see as the current threats to rule of law in both the US and Australia?
Ashley, that's a great big question. I'll try to answer it as best as I can. But I think the big thing, what we see from the past sort of 20 years in the US is the administrations, it's the broad expansion of executive power that began really in earnest under the Bush administration following the attacks of September 11th and has continued by all administrations. And then obviously we've seen the Trump administration, its most recent, the use of executive orders and the crackdown on certain areas such as immigration. And really probably the most concerning from a legal side is this sort of administration targeting law firms that might be advocating for people that don't necessarily agree with that administration's policies.
Okay, that's a great answer. Thanks, Dan. And yeah, I definitely think it's something, even within NJP, amongst our colleagues, we've had discussions about those points as well. It's all really concerning. You mentioned a little bit about, the space in the US post 9/11. I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on how this new era compares to the significant crackdowns on human rights that we saw under the guise of the war on terror.
I mean, 9/11 was such a horrific incident, and it sort of gave the Bush administration carte blanche to do whatever it wanted. And we saw it expand the power of taking people to Guantanamo Bay and the use of military tribunals, the expansive use and the rise of drone strikes, of targeting individuals based on just an executive decision that that person poses a threat on what they might do in the future or what they've done in sort of being that judge and executioner. And that unfortunately has been an executive power that continued through every president since George Bush and after September 11th, and it hasn't gone away, and it's sort of been accepted by the international community. There really hasn't been a lot of pushback by other governments, and we see other governments starting to utilize the same tactic or justification of labeling people terrorists and then taking strong action against them.
That's really interesting, and I think one of the big differences between Australia and the US is that, of course, you have a constitutional Bill of Rights, and so I'm wondering how the US judiciary is responding, and how the Bill of Rights provides protection, and how can the judiciary respond when it is also under attack?
Yeah, I mean, the judiciary can never really respond, right? Unless someone brings a case, the judiciary doesn't have anything to act on. And so I think we see in the US, and one of the great things about NJP is that it's looking for strategic litigation to challenge policies. And you have that in the US. You've got a lot of organizations, independent, that don't take government funding, that are standing up for either an individual case or for a broad action. And you see the courts being used to challenge executive power. And in the United States, we have at least a Bill of Rights that we can rely on, whether it's going to be in the area of allowing protests and pushing back on government action on restricting protests. We have the Bill of Rights. We have our freedom of expression, our freedom of speech, freedom of the press. That is not present in Australia or many.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there, I suppose, maybe it would be helpful for people if you spoke a little about some of the challenges that are currently on foot. It's been a lot in the media about birthright citizenship, and it's really interesting to follow the work of organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union. What are the big challenges at the moment, just broadly?
Broadly, obviously, in the area of immigration and immigration detention and the canceling of visas for people who are already in the US, and then trying to use their public statements now as a motivation to kick them out of the United States. The crackdown on the border, which obviously, in the United States, that's a big issue. It was a big issue in the election. It's something that Australia seems to have successfully stopped people coming in, the boats, or maybe it's just not getting publicized as much. If people are really interested, there's a great website out there. It's www.lawfaremedia.org, and it tries to track all the litigation that's going on. And according to that, there's over 300 active cases right now involving, executive power, and there's several that the executive are bringing, and they vary from representing an individual, such as the Center for Constitutional Right, who's advocating. I'm going to probably pronounce his last name wrong, Muhammad Khalil, who was a student, right, and is being detained right now due to being involved with protests. And so you've got those individuals, you've got states that are going together to challenge federal action, executive power, the whole termination of different branches, not branches, but different agencies in the United States is a huge, and these are all going through the courts. And while it does seem, some people may say, the executive is overstepping its bounds, we do see the judiciary getting involved. We may not ultimately agree with what the court decides, the lower court, but then it's going to the appeal court. And these cases, like citizenship birthright, is with the Supreme Court and just waiting for their rulings. And so it's happened relatively quickly. We're seeing the judiciary, and that's how the judiciary can respond, by speeding up the process. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. There also seems to be an unprecedented targeting of law firms and lawyers under the Trump administration. Could you tell us a little bit about how the US legal profession is responding to this situation, and what can Australian lawyers learn in terms of how to resist attacks on the legal profession and rule of law?
Well, many of the big firms that are getting sort of pressured by the administration are either going along with the administration and changing their internal policies, or they're resisting it and they're willing to lose the business that from the government. Um, I think you see from the overall sort of American Bar Association that as an organization is trying to defend these firms as a ruling body in the area of law. And again, that's a spot where these strategic litigation groups that aren't relying on government funding for their operations, like NJP. And so it's important to get those independent legal entities out there fighting, and that's probably where we're going to see the most ground made up and pushing back on the executive.
Absolutely. And of course, the independence of the legal profession is so fundamental to rule of law. And I think watching from afar and seeing a situation where law firms are, I suppose, capitulating in some of their disputes with the administration and providing support to causes that Trump is in favor of, rather than, pursuing their arguments through the courts, has been really interesting to watch. I suppose, do you have any thoughts about how here in Australia, if we would have a similar situation, what is it that lawyers in the US are doing to fight against that, those that are continuing to stand up for rule of law?
I think it's really just seeing those organizations that represent groups of, whether bar associations in the US, and that's really where that overarching body can be the one pushing back. So you're not getting individual lawyers targeted, and just identifying early on and trying to use the courts, and the courts are the most effective process to hold the executive. But obviously in the US, we get Bill of Rights. We've got different protections than you do here in Australia.
Yes, absolutely. Just a quick note for everyone that the website that Dan mentioned earlier, we've put a link to that in the chat for this Zoom. So I think that looks really interesting. So feel free to check it out. My next question is in relation to the significant cuts to public funding in the States. Civil society has clearly been disrupted as a result of those cuts. Have you started to see the flow and effect of this, and how are advocates continuing their work faced with this pressure?
I think advocates, those nonprofit groups, are actually seeing more support from the public, because the public wants to see cases being brought against the administration and trying to check on the executive power. And so I think there are people, the philanthropy, the understanding that strategic litigation is the only way to check the executive. And so, well, sort of, there is some reduction in what might be available to some of the publicly funded groups. You're seeing the private nonprofit filling that gap and really trying to take the lead.
Well, that's probably an interesting segue into some of our alternative first responders project here at the National Justice Project. There've been in the States significant cuts to Justice Department grants in relation to police reforms and efforts to build alternative first responder initiatives. So can I ask you, Chloe, given that in both Australia and the US, people do often call 000 or 911 simply because they don't know who else to turn to, whether it's a crisis, a concern, or something that doesn't require an emergency response. What are alternative first responders, and how do they work in these situations?
Thank you so much, Ashleigh, for the question. And I think really stepping back and looking through the lens of Australia is, unfortunately, at the moment, we have very limited options outside of our 9 to 5 business hours where people can call for further support. And whether this is for an immediate need or just, a concern of, this is something that I think needs is beyond me and beyond my scope, but who can I turn to, or where can I call for further guidance? It really does lead us down to often picking up the phone and dialing 000, or in the States would be 911. And for examples, this could be anything from a crisis emergency, or this could be my neighbour's having a party next door and the music is extremely loud and I, don't agree with this and want it to be turned down, or concern for someone out in the public as well, or seeing someone graffiti a wall. At the moment, people have very limited options of either expressing, a desire for something to happen, a response, or a genuine emergency need. Because of this, we have police as often this entry point, because when we call 000, you get asked fire, ambulance, or police. And quite often this, people go, I don't know, is it ambulance? Is it police? Could be fire, could be all of the above. And at the moment, through the triage system, often the decision is that the best response is police. Although what we are seeing, and again, similar examples in the US, is like this isn't always the most appropriate response. And if anything, when we have these entry points grow and grow and grow, and we keep using that same first response of, we don't know, let's send police, we are suddenly having greater exposure to a law enforcement response that may just not be needed in that time. Equally, people being hyper exposed to policing because there are, structural, racism and other things that exist in our responses. And this is just not providing the outcomes that ultimately is needed when people are calling 000 for that, hey, I need further support. And I think a really interesting way to look at this is, I believe in the US, it's called EMT, emergency medical technician. In Australia, it'd be paramedic. This was once not in that ecosystem of response. And slowly this alternative, or what was seen as an alternative, has become such part of the bread and butter of this emergency response ecosystem. What we're seeing that has been the case for the US over the years is that we have alternatives. In Australia, this isn't the case yet. It's a very new emerging policy area, but one that is growing, which we're really excited about. And so when we have a scenario, we do not need to have police attend. We can have highly skilled people. And this is where your alternative first responders kick in. And whether it's to de-escalate, be an ear to listen, people that have curiosity and concern, they are part of this growing ecosystem of available options for the community, which ultimately the goal is to reduce contact with law enforcement, but also making sure people are getting the right response to what they need for what they're calling for as well. And I guess I've gone on about how this is quite common in the US, very new for us in here in Australia. And Dan, I was going to ask you, part of the campaign here at the National Justice Project is looking into these models internationally. And from what I can see in the US, there's over 250 examples, and ARC, A3, their team, MRSS, CHAT, CRESS, seems like it needs to be an acronym to be an alternative first responder model. But I guess over your time and your work as also being a police officer, is how have you seen that narrative shift so that you are at that point in the US that you have such an array of options?
It's grown, and obviously in larger population centers, that need is really where cities have tried to develop this different response, and either through a partnership with police, such as putting a mental health worker, a social worker that is part of the police unit that can respond and go out with the police. So you have that partner there that can handle different situations versus just the tools that the police have, right? Police are sent there, they have the tools that they have. And so by giving a social worker, they have a different network, they have different skills. Or you see completely independent responders. You might have in Denver, they have a team that has a social worker, an EMT, and they're out on patrol and they're being proactive on looking for individuals that they can assist or get a call and already be out there. So they could be potentially the first one there. And so I think every city has that it's really grown is put their little local flavor to it, because I don't think there's a one answer fits all depending on the demographics and the population density. And so I think that's trying to develop flexible solutions for each particular area. But it's also, I think, one of the big changes, and I don't know if you feel this in Australia, but it's also getting a change to the mental health providers' traditional, you make an appointment, you come to the office, right? And we work from office hours, from 8 in the morning till 5. Well, people have mental health crises outside of office hours, and having that availability has shifted. And we know we have crisis centers have have come up, and that's 24 hours because we don't know when someone's going to have a crisis. And so it's also sort of getting a change to the mental health provider profession to be willing to do something than the traditional office hours, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I think that's what we're sort of seeing in a lot of these examples is it's about getting people help, maybe not even at the crisis response, but really working in a model that is able to be the whole holistic approach. And people want community to be in that response. And I think, you explained that really well.
Yeah, thank you both so much. Just a quick note for everyone that we have put a paper by Chloe and her team here at the National Justice Project in the chat, outlining the Alternative First Responders Project. And I'm sure everyone will find that a great, insightful read. Dan, can I ask you, just following on from this discussion, in your work, have you witnessed the impact of seeing someone using de-escalation skills outside of police? And did it change your view on how we create safety?
I mean, look, my personal experience, I was always worked in small town policing, which I think has a different, people that live in the town, that are policemen that live in the town, there's already that sort of part of community response, which breaks down this sort of difference between the people that are and the police officers, because you know them from coaching their kid in sports. So there is a little bit more of that. In New Hampshire, they started bringing out the availability to have mental health providers available at least by phone, right? That was the first step, right? So that when I showed up at a house and there was a person that was going through a mental health crisis, my option was either to arrest them for a crime or forcibly commit them to a hospital. Now they gave us a third tool, right? We could get them on the phone with a mental health provider who's trained to deal with this. And those are the type of tools that I wanted as a police officer. And every time I used it, it de-escalated the situation. And we were either, it resolved the situation, or B, we were able to get the person transported to the mental health providers, not being put into the criminal system to get the mental health, which is the huge problem with many issues. People going through mental health crisis, they end up getting into the criminal system when that's not really where they belong, and it doesn't help anybody.
Absolutely. Chloe, did you want to add anything to that before we move along?
Yeah, and I think what Dan has said is really important is, we're looking at people being able to have the right skills in order to really resolve a situation that truly embodies public safety. I think, not locking people up or criminalizing people for having what is a social and health need, but also sometimes being able to recognize whether people have a disability, whether a hidden or obvious, and those skills in terms of tactfully working with people going through gender-based violence, that we're requiring huge broad skill sets that I think is really important stays with people who have been trained, constantly retraining in these skills, and are really dedicated to providing that support. And what's been really great to see in the US is exactly what you said, Dan. It's sort of like it's limitless, the options, and it's really about working with community of what needs are, and often bringing community into that response. So you have a community-led organisation that really knows the landscape that they're working with. It's extremely localised and can have a lot of those ongoing relationships with people because, as you would probably reflect on, Dan, as well, it's not like just that one support in that moment, it's where it ends. It often needs to be a continuation and a continuity of care that just can't be provided in one response and wrapping it up nicely. And I'm not too sure, Dan, if you saw that effect of what continuous care looked like as well.
That's always been the biggest challenge, right? You hit it. If there was limitless funding, right? That's the one limitation for this whole thing is funding, and how you get the most services for the least cost, right? That's a government struggle that regardless of what area they're in. But getting that, when and that was really the success. So you'd get the person on the phone with the mental health team that at the night when they're having it, but then it's the follow-on care that they are going to continue to get in the community. And yeah, it's a big challenge, and it's great that NJP is trying to really push this here in Australia, because it's going to save lives and it's going to improve lives.
Great, thank you. I suppose tying this discussion back to what we were speaking about earlier in terms of rule of law and democracy, just curious, I suppose as a democratic society, there is the case that the public should and must have a voice in how it's policed and what this looks like. So is democracy under threat if we don't respond to these asks for alternatives? I might throw to Dan first, actually.
Isn't that the poll question? Democracy, that's a big one, right? We always say, is democracy under threat because of this? It's really the threat to individuals, and whether it's going to be one of my relatives, one of my friends, because mental health can affect everybody. And if one of my kids were to have a crisis, I'd want someone to show up that could help them with that. And it's sort of unfair to put this big challenge on a police officer. We can't expect them to be experts in crime fighting, mental health, right? All these different aspects. And so I think we do a disservice to the general public if we don't have the proper responses.
Absolutely. No, please continue, Dan.
I was just going to say, is it a threat to democracy? Hopefully we have an electorate that these issues resonate with them, and they're going to demand of their representatives to look at these alternatives.
Chloe?
I had a different answer, and then I heard something that Dan said earlier. And I think tying it all together, and I guess this idea of using the courts to hold the executive accountable, and with, I guess, the work at the National Justice Project and why this campaign came to be from using the court system is time and time again having coronial inquest outcomes state that first and foremost that deaths were preventable. And then following on from that is having greater access to other services or other sort of supports was part of that scenario that would have prevented the death as well. So I think if you have the courts coming back and reflecting on what we could say is at times, concerning police powers of what's allowed or not allowed to do, and are saying this is why this has caused a death and what can we do about it. Here are also what is needed and really robust recommendations. If the executive is then not responding to that, we could say that democracy is slightly under threat, or at the very least, what is the democratic process to make sure those recommendations from coronial inquests are turning into action. And as you would know, as the Principal Legal Officer, Ash, unfortunately, these coronial recommendations are not binding, as much as we sometimes would like all of them to be. But it's part of that democratic process of looking at these legal and policy that we have around policing and how can we make them better. So if we have courts saying, let's make them better, this is what's needed, an alternative or further supports, I would say the democratic response would be to listen to that.
Absolutely agree. Okay, well, I think we're going to actually take a moment to do another poll. Would you like to give an overview of that, Chloe? Or here it is. So maybe I'll just read it out. So if communities ask for alternatives to a police first response, is it undemocratic to ignore them? Yes, ignoring these voices threatens democracy. No, alternatives aren't necessary if current systems work, or not sure / depends on the situation. So we'll just give everyone a moment to respond to that. Panelists can also respond. Let's see.
So it might be given away already.
Okay. I suppose while we're waiting for the poll results to come in, just to remind everyone that you're very welcome to ask any questions in the chat. If you like some of the questions in there, feel free to upvote them, which means they're more likely to be asked. And we will be turning in a moment to a few questions from people in the audience, which will be great. So maybe just a few more moments, and then we'll see what people think in terms of the poll, how they feel about that, and whether they agree with our panelists today.
Well, there's some tough questions showing up in that Q&A. I took a peek. Remember, I don't speak for the US and the United States. I'm not.
Yes, of course. Okay. Here we go. Here are the answers. So most people do think that, yes, ignoring these voices threatens democracy. That's 63%. 4% think that no, alternatives are not necessary if current systems work. And 33% are not sure, / depends on the situation, which I think probably really brings home the point that the campaign and the education around that will also be really interesting in terms of engaging people and working through some of those issues, and engaging people and obtaining their feedback about where we should go from here.
Because if you don't know what the other options are, you don't know whether it's needed, right? And so I think really getting some pilot programs really working in some of the major cities across Australia would really demonstrate how successful it would be. And I think it would actually, I think police officers would love to have other people responding to certain situations.
Absolutely. Chloe, did you want to jump in before we go to some audience questions?
Yeah, I think, and look, the uncertainty, I think, is because we haven't had really strong, consistent policy courage to give this a go. And I think, we have 12-month pilots and really short-term and short-lived programs. But if we really invest in that robust ecosystem in an alternative first response, I think similar to the US, I hope one day we have 250 examples to lean on of really, programs that not only have survived but have lived and thrived and are going into their decade of providing a community service. And this community service is one that will reflect, like the EMT, like our paramedics, and speaking to a lot of think tanks over in the US, there's even now discussions around, do we even call this an alternative first responder anymore? Because really, it's part of that first responder ecosystem. Are we even speaking to an alternative anymore? And I think as what we're doing in this campaign is we would love to see the same thing happen here, but we need that policy courage to see the long-term investment and getting the bang for the buck as well. So the results will speak for themselves, and we'll keep campaigning.
Thanks, Chloe. And yes, I absolutely recommend the paper put together by our Alternative First Responders team, which you can find a link to in the chat. So let's go to our first question from the audience. How important is the people movement, the grassroots movement in the US and Australia to protect democracy and the rule of law? Great question. Maybe I'll throw to you first, Dan.
Oh, you didn't go in order. I was looking at the first question going, that's not the first question. I mean, obviously, right, it is the grassroots root movements that make up constituencies that get elected officials to take notice. And that's the way policy changes occur through, we hate to say it, right? But unless an elected official is worried about not winning the next election, they're not going to be so motivated on trying to change a policy. And so it's really getting groups of people within a particular electorate to make sure that their individual representative knows that this is of concern to them. And then that will trickle up. And so you can't underestimate the power of just the community coming together.
Absolutely. It's such an important democratic function, I think. What do you think, Chloe?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think well, I know, no, I think we addressed this in our position paper in terms of what we can draw upon from community strength around an alternative first responder model. And as Dan said, these things are often quite localized to a specific area, but that investment from community for better responses is what makes the response live on. And a lot of the times people are caring for each other in ways because people don't feel comfortable engaging with police. And that's the unseen, unheard and hidden work as well. This definitely does exist in Australia, even though we don't have it on a policy level, alternative first responders. But that investment from community and that knowledge and that expertise and strength is what makes the most robust alternative first responder models. And most of the models in the US are by community run and led organizations. Communities in that, it's the people power that has kept that going.
Absolutely. Thank you. Turning back to our discussion on the rule of law, and this is a question that I think is close to my heart because I'm very concerned about successive efforts to undermine protest rights in Australia across a number of jurisdictions. So what can Australia do to protect our right to protest more robustly? Dan, what do you think?
Get a Bill of Rights.
Yes.
First, get a Bill of Rights. I think that is the big thing, right? And obviously you've got to get the legal community to be willing to take on these cases so that when people are prosecuted for protesting, that these are going to be cases that are going to be hard fought, right? And making sure that when protests happen, the individuals, the organizers, the protests know what are the bounds, what cannot do, and there might be certain rules that need to be challenged, right? But otherwise, you want to make that protest within the bounds so your voice can be heard.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's extremely important. And to go back to the earlier question about people power, I think when you do have a situation where laws are being passed and they're eroding our protest rights, it's also back to the community to speak out against that. So Chloe, what do you think on this question?
Talk about alternative first responders for hours and hours, but I think like you said, tying it all together is there should be I think protest movements is what gets us a lot of these progressive policies over time. And like I said, one thing was during eras where what things are considered radical, and then fast forward 20 years later, it's actually just good common sense policy started off with protest and people movement. And because of that, it should always be fundamentally protected. And for a lot of us, it's why we also sign up to do the law. I think because one of the things that really motivated me was to really see and really inspired by people movement and protest as well. And I think that should always be protected.
I think one of the areas kind of just throw that's going to be interesting to see how this shakes up. It's the whole issue of masking during protest, right? Not only for the protesters, but in the US, we're seeing some states that they don't want the law enforcement response to be masked and hidden, right? So this sort of how that shakes out in the US or in Australia, can you require people to show their face, or can it be masked? Can you require law enforcement to be unmasked, right? Because part of protesting is, this is me saying this, right? Not just an anonymous person. This is me. I'm a member of this community, and this is how I feel. And I feel so strongly that I'm willing to make my feelings known publicly. If you're hidden, you're not really embracing that. And if law enforcement is hidden, I don't like to see that either, right? And so that's going to play out here in the next, I think, couple of years.
That's really interesting. And also from an accountability perspective, if you've got police and, well, in some cases, even have the military over there in the States now, which is really scary.
They're not masked.
But yeah, absolutely. That's probably a good segue into the next question from our audience, which is really interesting. So one for you, Dan. You have and still currently work in both the US and Australia. What do you find the best and worst parts of the legal system in each country?
That's a broad question. I
It
mean,
is.
I from both countries, there's very much a community sense, I think, in the legal communities. You know, when I was involved with the Hicks case, the legal community in Australia is very supportive, and I felt that both in Australia and in the US, there were the groups that wanted to stand up, and you see it today. You know, there's different parts of the legal community that really advocate for individual rights and holding the executive. And I think that's the best part of it, you know. The worst, I don't know what I'm not going to comment on what the worst parts are.
Okay, fair enough. Chloe, as well as being our campaign lead, you formerly practiced law. Do you have any thoughts, probably specific to the Australian legal context? Is there anything that really stands out to you as either the best or worst part of our legal system?
I think what's really interesting about this, because look, there's a lot of things to criticize on both ends and a lot of things to celebrate on both ends. But what's really interesting is it did surprise me how robust and vigorous alternative first responder models are in the US, and how often that is an absolutely go-to example of this working really well. And so in that scenario, I'd love us to follow suit. Maybe in other things, which I'll keep the list to myself. I wouldn't like us to necessarily follow suit. But in terms of this campaign and truly and looking at models that um, are community led and run and are localized and are really producing positive results, Australia should be looking to the US for those policy considerations around alternative first responders.
Absolutely, thank you. I suppose to turn back to what is happening in the States at the moment, in particular in LA with the National Guard and military having a strong presence at protests there. Many see that as a misuse of uniformed services and forces at the moment. What do you think this is doing to the community's view of policing?
You're asking me, does Chloe want to answer that?
I think let's start with you, Dan.
Look, the use of the military in these to protect property and to support the police, you know, it's already being legally challenged in the US, right? So we're going to see the courts weigh in very, very quickly. Some have gone the administration way, some are going against, but that's going to be ruled on. You know, if you see the military is not masked. The military has their name, right? On their uniform. You can tell who it is. They're right. Many of these people are probably from California. Hopefully, at the end of the day, we're going to say they were very professional and nothing really comes of it. But I think the courts are going to weigh in relatively quickly on it. And you know, you can watch the protests and out there in LA, and I wonder, why are they destroying all these private people's businesses, right? What about the people who are being injured, right? We're not talking about people in the street holding signs, but there's been a lot of damage to private property and looting. And what is the obligation of the government to protect everyone? And whether the law enforcement were capable or not capable, it's going to be an interesting case to see how it works out. You know, obviously I'm a little biased because I was in the military, right? And I have, you know, and that's, but I can understand it from people who weren't in the military that it does not look good when you see the military on the streets enforcing. And that's why we have the Posse Comitatus Act, which forbids the military from enforcing domestic law in the United States unless the act in rebellion and all that. So it's very rarely are you going to see the military actually enforcing laws. You might see them standing guard and protecting a building. But it's going to be an interesting case to follow here in the courts in the next several months. It'll be resolved.
I think that will be very interesting to see. I think, you know, as kind of suggested by the question, and certainly my view as well, would be that it's quite disconcerting to have the military at being deployed to protests, and very concerning, in terms of the state of democracy over there. Just a reminder for everyone, we've got some links in the chat today. One of them is the pledge for alternative first responders. So I might just ask Chloe if you would like to jump in and explain what the pledge is.
Yeah, so and I think maybe this is even a nice little segue from the previous question around perception as well. And I think with the pledge is what we're asking is our community to put forward, do they support alternative first responders? And then also, why is this important to you? And what we are hearing from community and why we fight so fearlessly alongside the families we work with to uncover truth and uncover what has happened around policing and police actions is that people are witnessing force that they don't agree with, and also witnessing not the best outcomes, and they want change and they want a better option for people and for loved ones themselves and others that don't have to rely on police. And so if you have a story to share, or your thoughts of why this is important to you too, like other members of our community, I really encourage people to hop on our website and make that pledge and share why this is important to you as well.
Great, thank you, Chloe. I have signed the pledge. Looking forward to continuing to follow that. I have another question for you, Chloe. We are expecting the Victorian government to withdraw from the commitments it made to implementing the recommendations from the Royal Commission into Mental Health, including a health-led crisis response. Are there any mechanisms to hold them to account for this?
Yeah, good question. And thank you to the audience member who asked that. I think this really comes back to some of our earlier answers around having organizations or law firms to have courage to push back on this, and then also really working with the grassroots movements around people wanting better outcomes. Similar to Croyle inquests, royal commissions are not binding. So as much as there may be recommendations made, we do have to really be strategic. And I think that was one of the things that stands out the most from what Dan has said earlier, is really being strategic in how we hold governments, state or federal, to account to make sure that there is some movement towards these recommendations. Unfortunately, they're not binding. So, challenging that in a court system or getting some sort of compensation for not acting on that is not available here in Australia. But it is about being really strategic and coming together in a coordinated response. And with the campaign that we are working on, we have a growing list of endorsements from organisations across Australia. And I think the more we share our resources and work together and be really strategic in that call for action and calling to commit to these recommendations, I think we will have a better chance at seeing governments follow through with them.
Thanks, Chloe. Dan, would you like to add anything to that?
No, that Chloe did a great job.
She did. Okay, well, just to let people know, we've got time for a few more questions from the audience. So here is another one that I think is very interesting, given concerns around misinformation, disinformation, and democracy. Is there anything that courts, policymakers in the US are doing in relation to fake news and regulating what information is allowed to be disseminated about current political situations? Dan, I'll throw to you first.
Right. I mean, this is a huge issue in the United States, right? Can the government mandate speech, right? And where you've got this concern about fake news, and you've also got this right of freedom of speech, right? Freedom of speech, does it apply to false information? The courts will decide. Yet there's other avenues. Like, and if you see in the US, there was a huge civil lawsuit. So you can take people to court for defamation and other civil actions, and that's been done. Where the Sandy Hook massacre, where somebody shot a bunch of kids, right? The families took a podcaster, a media person, and took them to court hundreds of millions of dollars, right? And that is a check on that individual person, but it does send a message and it has impact. That's the courts, are controlling those processes. I think it's going to be very difficult in the United States, where you have a right to free speech, to start shutting down and government censoring speech. And with that right to free speech, comes a responsibility to be a educated, user of speech and knowledge. And I don't know if we're ever going to be able to stop the fake news on all these new social platforms. And then the question is, what responsibilities do the platforms have to weed out fake information? And that's being worked through the courts and through the process.
Thanks, Dan. That's really interesting, particularly your reference to the use of defamation law as a mechanism by which we can check that. That's something we've actually done here at the National Justice Project, creatively using defamation law to hold racism to account in particular cases. It's something we use given that we don't have a Bill of Rights, have to be a little bit creative about causes of action to hold things like that to account. So thanks for your response. Chloe, did you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I think reflecting back on the poll outcome of is it undemocratic to not listen to community concerns for alternative first responders is what often we are finding is with our position paper on why we're calling for alternative first responders is people read the stats, the evidence, the research, and they really are blown away about the impact of having a police first response. And this is often very new news for people. And I think really encouraging people to do research and look to, credible organisations, whether it's the National Justice Project or universities or other places and other organisations we fight alongside and scoping out those that information. And once people read the position paper, often come out on the other side with a completely different view of, hey, this is something that is worth exploring or giving it a go. I didn't know XY% of people were harmed by police. I didn't know they were the statistics or this even existed in Australia as an issue. So I think around this topic especially and looking at crime responses, it's really important to seek out as much knowledge as possible.
Thanks, Chloe. That's absolutely right. I think we've got just one or two questions left before we wrap up. The next one is, are we likely to see an Australian Human Rights Act anytime soon? Dan, Chloe, would you like to jump in, or I can speak to that one if you prefer?
I'm going to say no. That's my.
I mean,
maybe Ash, I can give you
yeah.
I'll pass the baton to you to answer on my behalf.
Sure. Look, I hope so. There's a lot of work being done in that space currently by our colleagues in the sector in particular. It would be a wonderful thing to see. I think Dan is rightfully perhaps a little bit cynical. We've spent many years here at the National Justice Project running strategic litigation very creatively because we don't have a Bill of Rights at a federal level. We do have a couple in the States, but not at a federal level, which is where we're bringing most of our claims. So it's something we'd love to see. I hope we see it. People are doing amazing work to get there. So good on them, and let's support them in that fight. But yes, let's wait and see. And in the meantime, we'll keep using creative legal arguments to hopefully achieve some important human rights outcomes all the same. Okay, so just looking at the time, Chloe and Dan, sorry I've jumped around a little bit, just wanted to get through those audience questions. Would you like to make any final remarks, anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up for today?
Go ahead, Chloe.
Thank you for this discussion. And I think, if one thing, looking at the state of justice in the United States, if the one thing we can take from it is to have the same amount of alternative first responder models as they do over there to here, to me, would be an absolute win and a great learning to take from the United States.
I guess I'd say, and I've kind of skimmed over the other questions. So, look, I think the state of the legal profession, both in the US and in Australia, is bright. I get to teach some of these young students and see that they're very energized. They're energized about human rights. They're energized about how international law can impact domestic laws. I think, the next generation is in law school now that's going to continue this fight for everyone's, individual rights, and trying to make the world a better place for everybody. And look, you may have concerns now with a particular administration in power. You see the courts are getting involved. You may not ultimately agree with the ultimate ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court, but the democracy, right? The check and balances is working. You have a judiciary that is trying to check the executive, and you have a legislature that is. We'd wish maybe it might be a little bit more involved in the U.S. at this point, but I think things are going to, the ship rights itself, and you might be worried about America at some point, but it rights itself, and I think the U.S. is going to continue moving ahead, and that's all going to come from all these young people that want to be lawyers and continue fighting the good fight.
Well, thank you both so much for your time. Really appreciate your insights, and thank you also to our fabulous audience. Your questions were great. Thank you so much for posting those and suggesting those. We've also added to the chat details about the National Justice Project's end of financial year campaign. We're about halfway through our fundraising goal with a couple of weeks to go, and we would be very grateful for any support. Thank you so much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day.